The entire school froze. That sound, deep, thunderous, unmistakable, rolled through the valley, like an earthquake you could feel in your chest before your ears even registered it. 400 motorcycles. A wall of chrome and leather converging on one small middle school in rural Oregon, their engines creating a symphony of power that shook windows and rattled doors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Teachers abandoned their lesson plans and rushed to windows. Students pressed their faces against glass, mouths falling open. The principal's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his face draining of all color because he knew, everyone knew, that something unprecedented was about to happen. But this wasn't an invasion. This wasn't a threat. This was a debt being repaid 48 hours earlier. A 2-year-old boy in a wheelchair had done something most adults wouldn't have the courage to do. He'd shared his only meal with a stranger who had nothing. A broke, exhausted biker sitting alone on a park bench, looking like he'd lost everything. And that one act of kindness, that one sandwich split in half by a kid who knew exactly what hunger felt like, was about to trigger a chain reaction that would shake this entire town to its foundation. Before we continue, if you believe kindness should be repaid tenfold, if you stand with those the world overlooks, drop your location in the comments right now. City and country. Let's build a global map of people who refuse to ignore compassion when they see it. Because what's about to happen in this small Oregon town, it needs to be seen everywhere. This story needs to travel across continents. This is Daniel Cooper. But if you asked anyone at Ridgemont Middle School in Ridgemont, Oregon, population 4,200, they'd tell you they barely noticed him. And that's exactly how Daniel had learned to survive. By being invisible. 12 years old, cerebral palsy, born 6 weeks premature with complications that would define every single day of his life. His legs didn't work the way other kids' legs worked. His left side was weaker than his right. His hands shook when he tried to write, turning simple homework into hour-long battles with pencils that wouldn't cooperate. His speech came slowly, deliberately, each word requiring effort and concentration that most people never had to think about. And because of all that, because his body betrayed him in ways visible to everyone, Daniel had become the invisible boy. He'd been in a wheelchair since he was 4 years old. 8 years of rolling through a world built exclusively for people who walk. 8 years of doorways too narrow, bathrooms he couldn't access alone, stairs that might as well have been Mount Everest. 8 years of watching other kids run during PE, play basketball at recess, race each other to the cafeteria, while he rolled behind them, always slower, always separate, always different. 8 years of birthday parties he wasn't invited to because it might be too hard for him to get around. 8 years of group projects where he was the last one picked, if he was picked at all. 8 years of eating lunch alone because sitting with the disabled kid might damage your social status. But Daniel's broken body didn't define his brilliant spirit. He loved science, astronomy especially. At night, when his mother was working her second shift at the Flying J Truck Stop Diner on Route 26, Daniel would wheel himself onto their apartment's small second-floor balcony, the one accessibility feature his mother had fought the landlord for months to install, and stare up at the vast Oregon sky. He had a notebook, worn and dog-eared, filled with sketches of constellations, questions about black holes, calculations about light years, dreams of NASA and space stations, and a future where his legs wouldn't matter because in zero gravity, everyone floated the same. His science teacher, Mr. Patterson, said Daniel had the mind of a college physics student trapped in a 7th grader's struggling body. That on written tests, when his hands cooperated, Daniel scored higher than anyone else in 3 grade levels. That given the right opportunities, this kid could do anything. But opportunities required money. And money was something the Cooper family didn't have. Daniel lived with his mother, Rebecca, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Ridgemont's only low-income housing complex. The Pines, they called it, though there were exactly 0 pine trees anywhere near the aging brick building with its cracked parking lot and perpetually broken elevator. His father had left when Daniel was 2, couldn't handle having a broken son. Couldn't deal with the medical appointments, the physical therapy, the stares from strangers, the reality that his child would never play catch in the pressed backyard or make the high school football team. He'd walked out one Tuesday morning and never came back. No goodbye. No forwarding address. Just gone, like Daniel's disability was contagious, and he needed to escape before it infected him too. Rebecca worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Mornings at the elementary school as a teacher's aide, $12 an hour. Afternoons cleaning houses for families who had more money in their couch cushions than Rebecca made in a week. Nights waitressing at the truck stop, serving coffee to long-haul drivers, and trying to smile through the exhaustion that had become her permanent expression. Insurance covered some of Daniel's medical needs, but not all. Not the special keyboard that would help him type faster. Not the custom wheelchair that would actually fit his growing body instead of the hand-me-down one he'd been using for 3 years. Not the physical therapy that might improve his mobility. Not the adaptive equipment that would let him participate in activities other kids took for granted. So Rebecca worked herself to the bone, came home at midnight smelling like coffee and cleaning supplies, and still had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying Daniel new leg braces. And Daniel saw all of it, understood all of it. At 12 years old, he carried guilt that no child should carry the weight of knowing his existence was expensive, that his mother's exhaustion was his fault, that if he'd just been born normal, maybe his dad would have stayed. Maybe his mom could sleep more than 4 hours a night. Maybe they wouldn't eat pasta and canned vegetables for dinner 6 nights a week. That's why Daniel never asked for anything, never complained when his wheelchair squeaked and pulled to the left, never mentioned that he'd outgrown his leg braces months ago, and they rubbed his skin raw. Never said he wanted the new astronomy book he'd seen at the library, because books cost money, and money meant his mother working another shift. Daniel had learned to make himself small, to need nothing, to take up as little space as possible in a world that already saw him as a burden. But Daniel Cooper had something most people never develop, a profound sense of empathy born from suffering. When you know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be dismissed, to have people avoid eye contact because your existence makes them uncomfortable, you recognize that pain in others. You see the invisible people because you're invisible too. And that's exactly what happened on that Tuesday afternoon in late October, 2 days before 400 motorcycles would descend on Ridgemont Middle School, October 22nd, 3:47 p.m. Ridgemont City Park. Daniel's mother was working the afternoon shift at the Henderson house across town, a sprawling 5-bedroom home that took 3 hours to clean properly. She wouldn't be done until 6:30, which meant Daniel had 3 hours to kill after school let out at 3:15. Most days, Daniel went straight to the public library. It was 4 blocks from school. The route was wheelchair accessible, and the librarian, Mrs. Chen, saved new astronomy books for him. She'd set them aside, called Daniel over when he rolled in, and let him sit in the corner by the window where the best natural light came through. Daniel could spend hours there, lost in distant galaxies, forgetting about his body's limitations while his mind traveled light years. But today was different. Today was Tuesday, which meant the library closed at 4 for staff meetings. And it was unusually warm for late October in Oregon, nearly 65 degrees with clear skies, the kind of day that only comes a handful of times before winter locks everything down. So Daniel rolled through downtown Ridgemont, taking the long way, killing time, past Miller's hardware store, where Mr. Miller always waved, past the post office where the steps made it impossible for Daniel to enter, so he'd learned to time his rolls past when Mrs. Rodriguez was taking her smoke break, and she'd help him if he needed stamps. Past Betty's Diner, where the smell of burgers made his stomach growl because he'd given half his school lunch to another kid who'd forgotten theirs. That's the kind of kid Daniel was. He had so little, but he shared what he had. The park was mostly empty this time of day. A couple of moms with toddlers at the playground on the far side, an elderly man walking a small dog, and on a bench near the basketball courts, the courts Daniel rolled past every day. Watching kids play a game he'd never be able to join sat a man who looked like he'd been through hell. He was big, maybe 6'2", broad shoulders, arms that suggested serious strength beneath the worn leather jacket. His hair was long, pulled back in a ponytail, more gray than black. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of deep creases that come from years of hard living and harder choices. A thick beard, streaked with white, covered his jaw, but it was his eyes that caught Daniel's attention. Even from 15 feet away, rolling slowly past, Daniel could see them. Exhausted, defeated, the eyes of a man who'd lost something fundamental. The man's clothes were dirty, not messy dirty, but road dirty. Dust and grime that suggested long miles on a motorcycle. His leather vest bore patches Daniel didn't recognize, worn and faded. His boots were scuffed, one sole separating slightly from the leather upper. And on the bench beside him sat a helmet, a backpack that looked nearly empty, and nothing else. No phone visible, no food, no water bottle, nothing. The man's head was in his hands, elbows resting on his knees, shoulders curved inward in the universal posture of despair. He wasn't crying, but he looked like he'd cried himself out hours ago and was now just empty. Daniel rolled past, kept going, made it another 10 feet before he stopped. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on his wheelchair's push rims, having an internal debate that lasted maybe 30 seconds. Daniel knew what hunger felt like, knew what it was like when you couldn't ask for help because your pride was the only thing you had left. Knew what it was like to be invisible because people simply chose not to see you. And this man, this big, scary-looking biker who probably intimidated everyone who crossed his path, this man was invisible right now. Sitting alone in a public park in broad daylight, and not a single person was checking on him. Not a single person was asking if he needed help. Just like no one asked Daniel if he needed help most days. The decision made itself. Daniel turned his wheelchair around a maneuver that required backing up, angling, pushing forward, adjusting, a whole complicated dance that able-bodied people never thought about, and rolled back toward the bench. The man didn't look up until Daniel's wheelchair was right in front of him, blocking his downward view of the pavement. Slowly, the man raised his head. Up close, Daniel could see he was probably in his early 50s. His eyes were bloodshot, face pale beneath the weathered tan. He looked sick, or exhausted, or both. There was a healing cut above his left eyebrow. His hands, when they dropped to his knees, were shaking slightly. "Hey," Daniel said. His voice came out quieter than intended, the way it always did when he was nervous. He tried again, louder. "Hey, mister, are you okay?" The man stared at Daniel for a long moment, as if trying to process that someone was actually speaking to him, actually seeing him. Then his gaze dropped to the wheelchair, back up to Daniel's face, and something in his expression softened. "I'm fine, kid," the man said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "Don't worry about me. You don't look fine," Daniel said with a blunt honesty that only 12-year-olds can pull off without seeming rude. "You look really sad." The man's jaw clenched. For a second, Daniel thought he'd made a mistake, crossed a line, that this stranger was going to tell him to mind his own business and get lost. But instead, the man's face crumpled slightly, just for a second, before he pulled it back together. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, kid. I am really sad." Daniel nodded. "Me too sometimes," he said. "It's okay to be sad." The man let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "How old are you?" 12. 12. The man repeated, like he couldn't believe he was having this conversation with a child. "Shouldn't you be, I don't know, playing or something?" Daniel gestured to his wheelchair. "Can't really play basketball," he said without bitterness, just stating fact. "And my mom's working, so I'm just around, killing time." The man looked at Daniel, really looked at him. Saw the too small wheelchair, the worn clothes, the backpack with a broken zipper, the quiet loneliness that Daniel carried like a physical weight. "What's your name, kid?" "Daniel." "Daniel Cooper." "I'm Marcus," the man said. "Marcus Webb. Everyone calls me Ghost." "Ghost," Daniel repeated. "That's a cool name. Are you a biker?" Marcus glanced at his vest, his motorcycle helmet on the bench. Yeah, was. I guess I still am. I don't know anymore. What happened? It was a simple question, direct. The kind of question adults rarely asked because they didn't really want to know the answer. But Daniel asked because he genuinely cared, and Marcus Ghost heard that in his voice. Lost my club, Ghost said quietly. Lost my brothers. Made some bad choices. Trusted the wrong people. And everything fell apart. Haven't eaten in 2 days. Spent my last $20 on gas to get here. Thought I could crash with an old friend, but he moved 6 months ago, and I didn't know. So now I'm just stuck, broke, alone, trying to figure out what the hell to do next. Daniel listened to all of this, his young face serious. Then he reached down and unzipped his backpack, which was hanging on the back of his wheelchair. I have a sandwich, Daniel said, pulling out a Ziploc bag containing half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's not much, just PB&J, but you can have it if you want. Ghost stared at the sandwich like Daniel had just offered him $1 million. Kid, no, Ghost said, shaking his head. That's your food. You need it. I ate half already at lunch, Daniel said, which was true. And I'll have dinner at home later. This was less true. Dinner would probably be ramen noodles again. But Daniel said it confidently. You said you haven't eaten in 2 days. That's worse than me missing a snack. Daniel, please, Daniel said. It makes me feel bad to see people hungry. Just take it. For a long moment, Ghost didn't move. He just stared at this 12-year-old disabled kid sitting in a worn-out wheelchair, offering his only food to a complete stranger who probably looked like someone parents warned their children to avoid. Then Ghost reached out and took the sandwich. His hands were trembling. Thank you, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. You have no idea. Thank you. Daniel smiled. You're welcome, Mr. Ghost. Ghost unwrapped the sandwich slowly, like he was afraid it might disappear. Then he ate it in 4 bites, barely chewing, swallowing like a man who'd forgotten what food tasted like. When he finished, he carefully folded the Ziploc bag and put it in his pocket, the habit of someone who'd learned not to waste anything. That was the best sandwich I've ever had, Ghost said, and he meant it. Not because the sandwich was gourmet, it was basic store-brand peanut butter and grape jelly on white bread, but because it came from a kid who had every reason to roll past, to ignore him, to prioritize his own needs, and instead stop to help. They sat together in silence for a few minutes, not an awkward silence, but a comfortable one. 2 invisible people who'd found each other for a moment. Then Ghost spoke. Can I ask you something, Daniel? Sure. Why'd you stop? Why'd you help me? Most people. He gestured vaguely at the park, at the world. Most people pretend they don't see guys like me. They walk faster, look away. But you stopped. You're just a kid. You've got your own problems, I can see that. So why? Daniel thought about this for a moment. When he answered, his voice was quiet but certain. Because people do that to me too, he said. Pretend they don't see me. Act like I'm not there. And it makes you feel like you don't matter, you know? Like you're invisible. I don't like feeling invisible, so I don't want to make other people feel that way. Ghost's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his eyes suddenly bright with tears he refused to let fall. You're a good kid, Daniel Cooper, he said. The world doesn't deserve you. Daniel smiled. My mom says I'm going to do great things someday. I'm going to work for NASA and study black holes. I believe it, Ghost said. And he did. They talked for another 20 minutes. Daniel told Ghost about his astronomy dreams, about his mother working 3 jobs, about school, and being invisible, and how he'd learned that stars are basically giant nuclear explosions held together by gravity, which he thought was the coolest thing ever. Ghost told Daniel about riding motorcycles since he was 18, about brotherhood and loyalty, and how the best parts of his life had been spent on the open road with people who had his back. About how he'd made mistakes, lost that brotherhood, and was trying to figure out how to rebuild. You'll figure it out, Daniel said with the absolute confidence that only children possess. Good people always do. At 5:45, Daniel checked the digital watch his mother had given him for his birthday, a $12 Casio from Walmart that he treasured like gold. I have to go, Daniel said. My mom gets off work at 6:30, and I need to be home. Ghost stood up, towering over Daniel's wheelchair. Thank you again, Daniel. Seriously, you saved me today. I was in a really dark place, and you reminded me that good people still exist. Will you be okay? Daniel asked, concern in his young voice. Yeah, Ghost said, and for the first time, he actually believed it. Yeah, kid, I'm going to figure something out. Your sandwich bought me time to think. I'll be okay. Good, Daniel said, because the world needs good bikers too. Ghost watched as Daniel rolled away across the park, navigating the slightly uneven pavement with practiced skill, his two small wheelchairs squeaking with every push. This little kid who had nothing had given him everything, and Ghost made himself a promise right there. He would repay this debt. Somehow, some way, he would make sure Daniel Cooper knew his kindness mattered. But Ghost had no idea that 48 hours later, he'd have the chance to repay it with 400 witnesses. Marcus Ghost Webb hadn't always been broke and alone in a small-town park, questioning every decision he'd ever made. There was a time when Ghost was respected, when he wore his patch with pride, when he rode with brothers who'd die for him and he'd die for them. That was before everything fell apart. Ghost had joined the Phantom Riders Motorcycle Club 26 years ago, fresh out of the Marine Corps at age 25. He'd served 4 years, done a tour in the Gulf War, came home with a chest full of medals and a head full of ghosts, the kind that wake you up at 3 a.m. soaked in sweat, heart pounding, seeing faces of people who didn't make it home. The Marines had taught Ghost discipline, loyalty, honor. But it was the Phantom Riders who'd given him family. The club was based in Portland, Oregon. 53 members when Ghost joined, a mix of veterans, blue-collar workers, mechanics, and men who'd found brotherhood on 2 wheels and open roads. They weren't criminals despite what movies and TV shows suggested about motorcycle clubs. They were working, men who loved riding, who lived by a code, who took care of their own and protected their community. Ghost had risen through the ranks. Prospect, full member, road captain, and eventually vice president. He'd earned every position through loyalty and integrity. When a brother needed help moving, Ghost was there. When someone's family fell on hard times, Ghost organized fundraisers. When the club sponsored the annual toy drive for foster kids, Ghost worked tirelessly to make sure every child got a gift. He'd met his wife, Diane, at a charity ride. She was a trauma nurse at Legacy Emmanuel Hospital, tough as nails, with a smile that made Ghost forget how to speak. They married 2 years later in a ceremony where 50 bikers in leather vests stood alongside Diane's family in their Sunday best, 2 worlds colliding in the best possible way. They had a daughter, Emma, born with Diane's smile and Ghost's stubbornness, the light of his life. Emma grew up around the clubhouse, learning to ride a bicycle while bikers cheered her on, doing homework at the club's bar while Ghost and his brothers planned rides, completely safe and loved in a world that most people misunderstood. For 20 years, Ghost's life was good. Not perfect, no life is perfect, but good. Meaningful. He had brotherhood, family, purpose. Then, 3 years ago, everything crumbled. The Phantom Riders president, a man named Hank Mercer who'd founded the club 30 years earlier, started making decisions that didn't sit right with Ghost. Business partnerships with men who had criminal records. Money flowing through the club that came from sources no one would explain. Pressure on members to participate in activities that crossed lines Ghost wasn't willing to cross. Ghost spoke up, quietly at first, pulling Hank aside, expressing concerns, asking questions. But Hank had changed. Power and money had corrupted him. He didn't want questions. He wanted obedience. When Ghost refused to participate in what he saw as increasingly illegal activities, moving products he suspected were stolen, intimidating business owners who owed money to Hank's new partners, he was labeled a problem, then a traitor, then an enemy. The club split. About 15 members sided with Ghost, believing the Phantom Riders had lost their way. The rest stayed with Hank, either because they agreed with the new direction or because they were too afraid to leave. It got ugly. Patches were pulled, Lifelong friendships ended, threats were made. And then Diane got scared. She'd married a man who rode with honor, not a man caught in escalating club warfare. She gave Ghost an ultimatum: leave the life or lose his family. Ghost chose his family. He walked away completely, turned in his patch, sold his bike, got a straight job working construction. But the damage was done. Diane had already fallen out of love with the man. Ghost had become stressed, angry, defensive. The divorce was finalized 18 months ago. Emma, now 16, split time between parents, but was pulling away from Ghost, embarrassed by her father's past, wanting nothing to do with motorcycle culture. And Ghost? He'd lost everything that defined him. No brotherhood, no family, no purpose. 6 months ago, Ghost lost his construction job when the company downsized. Unemployment ran out, savings disappeared. He'd been couch surfing with old friends, the few who'd stayed neutral in the club split, but those situations had time limits. Last week, Ghost had hit rock bottom. He'd slept in his car for 3 nights before selling it to buy a used motorcycle, a beat-up Harley that barely ran, but was the only piece of his old life he could afford to reclaim. If he was going to be homeless, at least he'd be mobile. He'd ridden aimlessly for days, sleeping in rest stops, rationing the few dollars he had left. He'd thought maybe he could find his old Marine buddy, Jake, who'd moved to Oregon years ago. But when Ghost arrived in Ridgemont, he discovered Jake had relocated to California 6 months earlier. And that's how Ghost ended up on that park bench, broke and hopeless, and questioning whether it was even worth continuing. Until a 12-year-old disabled kid in a wheelchair stopped and shared a sandwich. That sandwich, that simple, beautiful gesture, did something Ghost's therapist had been trying to do for months. It reminded him that honor still existed, that kindness still mattered, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't irredeemable. After Daniel rolled away, Ghost sat on that bench for another hour, thinking. He still had his phone service disconnected, but Wi-Fi still worked, and he started reaching out to the few brothers who'd stood with him during the split. Jake Smokey Peterson in Seattle, Eric Mule Davidson in Eugene, Tony Chains Martinez in Bend, Carlos St. Rodriguez in Medford. Men he'd ridden with for decades. Men who'd lost their patches in their club, but never lost their code. Ghost's message was simple. Brother, I'm alive. Been dark. Ready to talk if you are. Within an hour, his phone lit up with responses. Brothers who'd been worried. Brothers who'd been searching. Brothers who'd felt the same void Ghost had been drowning in. And when Ghost told them about Daniel, about the kid with nothing, who shared everything, every single one of them said the same thing. We need to do something. Because bikers understand debt, understand honor, understand that when someone shows you humanity at your lowest point, you repay it in a way they'll never forget. Ghost started making plans. Thursday morning, 7:15 a.m., Ridgemont Middle School. Daniel rolled through the front entrance, navigating the morning chaos with practiced ease. Kids rushed past him, backpacks bouncing, voices loud, everyone in their own world. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage body spray, that unique middle school combination. Nobody said hi to Daniel. They never did. He was furniture at this point, something you moved around but didn't really notice. Daniel made his way to his locker number 127, bottom row. Because, of course, the school had assigned the disabled kid to the lowest possible locker, requiring him to basically lie down in his wheelchair to reach anything inside. He complained once to the principal, Mrs. Henderson, asking if maybe he could have a higher locker that would be easier to access. She'd smiled that condescending smile adults use when they're about to say no but want to pretend they care, and said, Daniel, I'm sure you can manage. It's good for you to stretch and reach. Builds character. Builds character. As if Daniel needed more character-building experiences in his life of daily struggle. He was digging through his locker, trying to find his English homework, when he heard the laughter. That specific kind of laughter that made his stomach drop, because he knew exactly what it meant. Brandon Mitchell, 8th grader, captain of the wrestling team, king of Ridgemont Middle School's social hierarchy. and Daniel's primary tormentor. Brandon wasn't physically violent, he was too smart for that. Physical bullying left evidence, got you suspended. But psychological torture? That was an art form Brandon had mastered. "Hey, Wheels," Brandon said, his voice carrying down the hallway, ensuring maximum audience. "Drop something?" Daniel didn't respond, just kept searching his locker, hoping Brandon would get bored and move on. He didn't. Brandon walked closer, his friends flanking him like backup singers. Tyler and Josh, both wrestlers, both disciples in Brandon's Church of Cruelty. "I'm talking to you, Wheels," Brandon said. And suddenly, Daniel's English homework, the paper he'd spent 2 hours on last night, hands cramping, letters shakily formed, was snatched from his locker. "Is this your homework?" Brandon held the paper up, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Dude, did you write this with your feet?" "Oh, wait. You can't use your feet either." Tyler and Josh laughed on cue. Daniel's face burned. "Give it back, Brandon. Give it back?" Brandon mimicked Daniel's slower speech pattern, the slight slur that Daniel couldn't control. "Give it back, Brandon." More laughter. "Please," Daniel said quietly. "Oh," he said, "please." Brandon held the paper higher, just out of Daniel's reach, even if he stretched. "But I don't know, Wheels. This handwriting is pretty bad." "Are you sure, Mrs. Patterson can even read this? Maybe I'm doing you a favor." And then Brandon tore the paper. Not in half, that would have been too quick. He tore it slowly, methodically, into smaller and smaller pieces while Daniel watched, while other students watched, while some of them looked uncomfortable, but none of them intervened, because intervening meant becoming a target. The pieces of Daniel's homework drifted to the floor like snow. "Oops," Brandon said, smiling. "Butterfingers." Then he walked away, high-fiving Tyler, leaving Daniel. Surrounded by the ruins of 2 hours of work, he'd now have to explain to Mrs. Patterson, who probably wouldn't believe him because who destroys a disabled kid's homework? That seemed too cartoonishly cruel to be real. Daniel sat there in his wheelchair, staring at the paper scraps, fighting back tears because crying at school was social suicide. He'd learned that lesson in 4th grade. He gathered what pieces he could reach, stuffing them in his backpack, knowing he'd have to stay up late tonight, redoing the assignment, knowing his hand would cramp and ache, knowing his mother would see him struggling and feel guilty because she couldn't afford the special equipment that would make this easier, knowing that tomorrow Brandon would probably do something similar because that's what Brandon did. That was Daniel's normal. That was every day. But in 48 hours, Daniel's normal was about to change forever, because Ghost hadn't stopped thinking about Daniel and the plan he was putting together with his scattered brothers. It was growing. Thursday, 2 p.m. A truck stop parking lot outside Eugene, Oregon. 8 motorcycles sat in a loose circle. 8 men who hadn't seen each other in months, some over a year, standing in leather vests that no longer bore official patches, but still carried the weight of brotherhood earned over decades. Ghost stood at the center, looking at faces he'd ridden with for 20 years. These men had stood with him when the Phantom Riders split, had lost their club, their patches, their identity, because they refused to compromise their code. Jake "Smokey" Peterson, 54, gray beard, former Army Ranger, mechanic by trade. He'd been Ghost's road captain, his right hand for 15 years. Eric "Mule" Davidson, 47. Built like his road name suggested, former Marine, worked construction when work was available. Tony "Chains" Martinez, 49, covered in tattoos, former Navy, ran a small welding business. Carlos Saint Rodriguez, 51, the quietest of the group, former Air Force pararescue, now a high school janitor. Ben Preacher Williams, 55, got his road name because he actually was an ordained minister, ran a small church in a rough neighborhood. Leo Tiny Johnson, 6'5", 280 pounds, none of it fat, former college football player who'd blown his knee, now a bouncer. Marcus Tank O'Brien, 43, youngest of the original group, former Army medic, currently worked as an EMT. These weren't criminals. These were working-class men who'd served their country, raised families, paid taxes, and live by a code that valued honor above everything. "Thanks for coming," Ghost said, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't try to hide. These were his brothers. He didn't have to pretend with them. "You called," Smokey said simply. "We answer. That's how this works." Ghost told them about the last few weeks, about hitting bottom, about the park bench, and then he told them about Daniel. "This kid," Ghost said, his voice breaking slightly. "He had nothing. I could see it. Wheelchair's too small for him. Clothes are worn, he's clearly struggling. But he stopped. Gave me his only food. 12 years old, and he understood empathy better than most adults I've met." "You said he goes to Ridgemont Middle School?" Carlos asked. "Yeah, lives with his single mom who works 3 jobs. Kid's got cerebral palsy, gets bullied constantly from what I gathered in our conversation, and still has the biggest heart I've ever seen." "So, what are you thinking?" Mule asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. "I'm thinking we pay him a visit," Ghost said. "Show him his kindness mattered. Show him what brotherhood looks like. Show that school that Daniel Cooper isn't invisible, isn't alone, isn't someone they can overlook." "I'm in," Smokey said immediately. "Same," from Mule. One by one, all 8 men agreed. "But 8 guys showing up is nice," Preacher said thoughtfully. "But you know what would really send a message?" Ghost nodded. "I made some other calls." Over the past 2 days, Ghost had reached out beyond his immediate circle. To brothers from other clubs he'd built friendships with over the years, to veterans riding groups, to independent riders who believed in the code even without a patch. The message was simple. Kid with cerebral palsy shared his lunch with a broke biker who had nothing. Want to show him kindness matters? Ridgemont Middle School, Friday morning, 8:30 a.m. The response was overwhelming. A Hells Angels chapter in Salem. 20 riders. A veterans MC group in Portland. 35 riders. The Iron Eagles from Bend. 15 riders. Southern Oregon riders. 28 riders. Independent riders from across the state. Men and women who heard the story and wanted to be part of something good. Dozens of them. Ghost's phone had been buzzing nonstop with confirmations. Brothers telling other brothers. Riding clubs putting aside territorial differences, because this transcended club politics. This was about honoring a child who'd shown compassion to a stranger. By Thursday evening, the count was at 150 confirmed riders. By Friday morning at 6 a.m., as bikers started rolling toward Ridgemont from all corners of Oregon, the number had grown to nearly 400. 400 motorcycles converging on a small middle school to honor a 12-year-old disabled boy who'd shared a sandwich. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Friday, October 25th, 8:15 a.m. Daniel's mother, Rebecca, was running late as usual. 2 hours of sleep after her truck stopped shift. Barely enough time to shower and change before she needed to drop Daniel at school and rush to her teacher's aide job. "Mom, it's fine," Daniel said from his wheelchair in their apartment's small living room. "I can wheel myself. It's only 6 blocks." "Daniel, we've talked about this," Rebecca said, gulping instant coffee that was more desperation than breakfast. "I don't like you going alone." "Mom, I'm 12. I need to be independent." "You taught me that." Rebecca looked at her son, this beautiful, brilliant boy who'd been dealt an unfair hand and never once complained and felt the familiar guilt squeeze her heart. "Okay," she finally said. "But you call me when you get there. Promise." Rebecca kissed Daniel's forehead, grabbed her bag, and rushed out the door toward her 15-year-old Honda that was held together by prayer and duct tape. Daniel waited 5 minutes to ensure she was really gone, then rolled to the door, navigating the apartment's narrow hallway with practiced precision. Down the building's ramp, the one his mother had fought for, had threatened legal action over, had finally won after 6 months of bureaucratic warfare. The morning was cold, Oregon's late October showing its true colors. Daniel's breath formed small clouds. He'd worn his warmest jacket, a thrift store find from 2 years ago that was getting too small but still functioned. 6 blocks to school. Daniel had the route memorized, knew every curb cut, every rough patch of sidewalk, every place where the pavement was uneven, and he needed to approach carefully. He rolled past the convenience store, where the owner, Mr. Patel, always waved. Past the laundromat that opened at 7 a.m. Past the abandoned lot where kids sometimes smoked before school. 3 blocks from Ridgemont Middle School, Daniel heard it. At first, he thought it was thunder, that deep, rolling rumble that comes before a storm. But the sky was clear, and the sound wasn't fading, it was growing. Daniel stopped his wheelchair, tilting his head, listening. That wasn't thunder. 2 blocks away, the sound was unmistakable. Motorcycle engines. Multiple engines. Dozens of them. The sound bounced off buildings, creating an echo that made it seem like it was coming from everywhere at once. Daniel's heart started beating faster. Not from fear, but from curiosity and something else, a feeling he couldn't quite name. 1 block away, he could see them. Motorcycles. Everywhere. Lined up along both sides of the street leading to the school. More pulling in. Chrome gleaming in the morning sunlight. American flags mounted on several bikes, snapping in the breeze. And the bikers, dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Daniel couldn't process the numbers standing beside their motorcycles. All of them facing toward the school. Daniel stopped at the corner, his hands frozen on his wheelchair's push rims, staring at this impossible scene. What was happening? Then he saw movement at the center of the gathering. A man walking toward him. A big man with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a leather vest, his stride purposeful. Even from a distance, Daniel recognized him. Mr. Ghost? Ghost smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. Hey, Daniel. What? What is this? Daniel gestured at the ocean of motorcycles. At the bikers who were now watching this interaction, at the scene that looked like something from a movie. This, Ghost said, crouching down so he was eye level with Daniel's wheelchair, is us repaying a debt. Debt? I don't understand. You shared your lunch with me when I had nothing, Ghost said, his voice thick with emotion. When I was at my lowest point, when I'd lost everything, when I was questioning whether life was even worth living, you stopped. You saw me. You helped me. And that one act of kindness? It saved me, Daniel. It reminded me what goodness looks like. Tears were forming in Daniel's eyes, but Ghost wasn't finished. So I called some friends, Ghost continued, gesturing to the gathered bikers. I told them about a 12-year-old kid with the biggest heart I'd ever seen. A kid who gets overlooked, who faces challenges every single day, but still chooses kindness. And every single person here, they wanted to meet you. They wanted to show you that your kindness matters. That you matter. Daniel couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his chest too full of emotion he didn't have words for. Ghost stood and turned to the gathered bikers. His voice carried across the crowd, amplified by the morning air and the absence of running engines. Brothers and sisters, this is Daniel Cooper, and Daniel's about to go to school. 400 bikers erupted in cheers. The sound was deafening, echoing off buildings, so loud that windows rattled and car alarms started triggering. Inside Ridgemont Middle School, classes hadn't started yet. Students were at lockers, in hallways, in the cafeteria finishing breakfast. Teachers were in their rooms preparing for the day. Then they heard it, that roar of engines and voices. Everyone rushed to windows. What they saw was impossible. Hundreds of motorcycles, hundreds of bikers, and at the center of it all, in a too-small wheelchair, was Daniel Cooper. Mrs. Henderson, the principal, went white as a sheet. She grabbed her phone, fingers trembling, started to dial the police. But outside, something was happening that would change everything. Ghost positioned his motorcycle right beside Daniel. Other bikers formed up, not in a threatening way, but in a protective formation, a corridor of chrome and leather leading directly to the school's front entrance. Daniel, Ghost said, would you like an escort to school? Daniel nodded, unable to trust his voice. Then let's ride. 400 motorcycles started their engines simultaneously. The sound was like standing next to a jet engine, a physical force that you felt in your bones. And slowly, majestically, with Daniel rolling in his wheelchair at the absolute center, surrounded by 400 protectors, the procession moved toward Ridgemont Middle School. Brandon Mitchell stood at his locker, heard the commotion, walked to the window, and saw Daniel, the kid he'd tormented yesterday, whose homework he'd destroyed, rolling toward the school, surrounded by an army. Brandon's face went gray. Tyler and Josh, his usual backup, suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The procession reached the school entrance. Ghost dismounted, as did dozens of other bikers. They formed two lines, creating a pathway, a corridor of honor. Daniel rolled between them, head high, no longer invisible, no longer alone. Every single student in that school watched. Every teacher, every staff member. They watched Daniel Cooper, the invisible boy, arrive like a king. And then Ghost did something that would make Daniel cry for the second time that morning. Ghost pulled out a child-sized leather vest custom made in the past 48 hours, rushed by brothers who understood symbolism mattered. On the back, beautifully embroidered, protected by brotherhood. On the front, over the heart, Daniel's name. This vest, Ghost said, his voice carrying across the sunpaid, now silent schoolyard, means your family. It means you're never alone. It means that anyone who hurts you answers to all of us. He draped it carefully over Daniel's shoulders. Daniel was crying openly now, 12-year-old tears of overwhelming emotion, of finally feeling seen, of understanding that his small act of kindness had created this impossible moment. "Thank you," Daniel whispered. "Thank you." And then, in perfect unison, 400 bikers placed their hands over their hearts. A salute, a promise, a pledge of protection. Inside the school, Mrs. Henderson finally lowered her phone. She wasn't calling the police anymore, because she realized, with startling clarity, that what was happening outside wasn't a threat. It was a reckoning. The rest of that Friday became legendary at Ridgemont Middle School. The kind of day people would talk about for years. The kind that became part of the school's permanent folklore. After the initial arrival, most of the bikers didn't leave. They couldn't all stay, work and responsibilities called, but roughly 50 remained in the school parking lot, a visible presence. Ghost, Smokey, Mule, and several others set up camp, making it clear they were there for the duration of the school day. Daniel rolled into school for the first time in his life, not as an invisible kid, but as someone everyone suddenly saw. Students parted in the hallways, not out of fear, but out of respect and maybe a little bit of shock. The kid they'd been ignoring, the kid some had bullied, had just arrived, escorted by 400 bikers. Brandon Mitchell made himself scarce. First period came and went, and Brandon was nowhere to be seen. Rumor spread that he'd faked sick and gone home. Tyler and Josh similarly vanished. In English class, Mrs. Patterson noticed Daniel's missing homework. He was holding the torn pieces in a Ziploc bag, trying to tape them together during morning break. "Daniel, what happened to your assignment?" she asked. Before Daniel could answer, 3 students spoke up simultaneously. "Brandon Mitchell tore it up," said Sarah Chen, a quiet girl who'd witnessed the hallway incident. "He destroyed it on purpose," added Marcus Johnson, who'd been too scared to intervene yesterday but found his courage today. "He's been bullying Daniel all year," said Emma Rodriguez, her voice angry. "And nobody did anything about it." Mrs. Patterson's face went from confused to horrified to furious in the span of 5 seconds. "Is this true, Daniel?" Daniel nodded. He'd never told on Brandon before. That only made things worse, but something had shifted. He had protectors now. He had people who cared. "This is unacceptable, Mrs. Patterson said. "Give me 10 minutes." She marched straight to the principal's office. Mrs. Henderson was already having a very bad morning. After watching 400 bikers descend on her school, she'd spent the past hour making phone calls to the district office, to the school board president, to her attorney brother-in-law, asking about liability. Everyone she called had the same question. Why were the bikers there? And when Mrs. Henderson explained that they were there to honor a student, to protect him, to show support, the next question was always, protect him from what? Why does a student need protection? That question hung in the air like an accusation. Now Mrs. Patterson burst into her office with Daniel's shredded homework, with witness testimony, with a year's worth of documented bullying incidents that had been dismissed or ignored. "We have a serious problem," Mrs. Patterson said. By lunch, Brandon Mitchell's parents had been called to the school. The police liaison officer was involved. The district office was demanding a full investigation into the school's anti-bullying policies, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Because here's what Mrs. Henderson hadn't realized. Ghost was smart. Before organizing the escort, he contacted local news stations, disability advocacy groups, and anti-bullying organizations. He'd framed it as a positive story. Community supports disabled student, but the underlying message was clear. This kid needed protection. Why? By noon, 3 news crews were in the school parking lot, interviewing bikers, students, and anyone who would talk. Parents started calling. Not to complain about the bikers, but to share stories of their own children being bullied, complaints that had been dismissed, patterns of administrative neglect that suddenly had a spotlight on them. Mrs. Henderson's job was in serious jeopardy. But for Daniel, Friday was magical. At lunch, instead of eating alone in the corner, he was surrounded by students who suddenly wanted to know him, wanted to hear about the biker escort, wanted to ask about his vest, wanted to be associated with the kid who had 400 bikers in his corner. Daniel handled it with grace. He wasn't mean to the kids who'd ignored him for years. He didn't gloat. He just existed, openly, visibly, finally seen. And outside, Ghost watched through the cafeteria windows, feeling something he hadn't felt in 3 years: purpose. 2 weeks later, the changes at Ridgemont Middle School were swift and dramatic. Mrs. Henderson had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into the school's handling of bullying complaints. Brandon Mitchell had been suspended for 2 weeks, then transferred to a different school. Tyler and Josh faced disciplinary action. But more importantly, the culture changed. A new principal, Mr. Jackson, implemented a comprehensive anti-bullying program with actual teeth. Anonymous reporting systems, swift investigations, real consequences, and a zero-tolerance policy for the kind of dismissive attitude that had allowed students like Daniel to suffer in silence. Disability accommodations were reviewed and improved. Daniel got a higher locker. The school invested in adaptive equipment. Teachers received training on inclusion and accessibility. For Daniel, the changes were life-altering. He'd become something of a local celebrity. The local newspaper ran a feature story, the sandwich that changed everything. News outlets across Oregon picked it up, then regional news. Then a segment on national morning television. But the real change was subtler and more profound. Daniel wasn't invisible anymore. Students said hi in hallways. Teachers checked in with him. He'd been invited to join the science club, something he'd wanted to do for years, but had been too scared to ask about. He had friends now. Real friends who valued him for his mind, his kindness, his humor. Rebecca, Daniel's mother, had experienced her own transformation. The story had reached her employers, and suddenly the single mother working 3 jobs to support her disabled son became a sympathetic figure deserving of help rather than just another struggling worker. The elementary school increased her hours and her pay. Several families she cleaned houses for gave her raises. Most significantly, a local disability advocacy nonprofit reached out with a grant program that could fund Daniel's adaptive equipment, his physical therapy, the wheelchair that actually fit his growing body. For the first time in years, Rebecca could breathe, could sleep more than 4 hours a night, could imagine a future that wasn't just endless work and worry. But the most important change involved Ghost. Marcus Ghost Webb had found his purpose again. The escort had reminded him, reminded all his scattered brothers that the code they'd lived by for decades still mattered. That brotherhood wasn't about patches or clubs or territorial politics. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. In the weeks following Daniel's escort, Ghost and his core group of 8 brothers had reformed. Not as the phantom riders that name belonged to a past that had become corrupted, but as something new. They called themselves the Guardian Brotherhood. No official club structure. No territorial claims. Just a loose network of riders committed to community protection and service. They started a program, Guardian Escorts. Any student being bullied, any kid who needed protection, could request an escort. The brothers would show up, walk them to school, make it clear the child was protected. Within a month, they conducted 17 escorts across 3 counties. Every single one resulted in bullying problems being taken seriously by school administrators who suddenly understood there would be visibility and accountability. Local news covered several of these escorts. The positive press was overwhelming. The stereotype of bikers as criminals or threats was being actively dismantled by men who simply showed up and protected kids. Other motorcycle clubs took notice. The Guardian Brotherhood model spread. Portland, Seattle, Sacramento, Phoenix. Veteran riders across the country were starting similar programs, all tracing their inspiration back to one kid sharing a sandwich. But for all the media attention, all the program expansion, all the systemic change, the most important thing was personal. Ghost and Daniel had formed a real bond. Ghost started visiting Daniel weekly. Sometimes they'd hang out at the park where they'd first met. Sometimes Ghost would take Daniel to his small garage workspace and teach him about motorcycles, showing him how engines worked, letting him help with repairs despite his shaky hands. "You've got good instincts," Ghost would say when Daniel successfully diagnosed a carburetor problem. Natural mechanic. They'd talk about everything. Daniel's astronomy dreams. Ghost's Marine Corps stories. What it meant to be honorable when the world made it hard. How to keep going when things seemed impossible. Ghost became the father figure Daniel had never had. And Daniel became the reminder Ghost needed that good still existed in the world. Rebecca initially had reservations, her son hanging out with a biker, but Ghost's character was undeniable. He was respectful, reliable, never missed a visit, never made promises he couldn't keep. He was exactly the kind of positive male influence Daniel needed. 3 months after the escort, on a cold January afternoon, Ghost showed up at Daniel's apartment with something in the back of his truck. "I've got a surprise for you," Ghost said. He pulled out a custom-built wheelchair. Not a hospital model, not a hand-me-down. A legitimate, high-end, custom-fitted adaptive wheelchair designed specifically for Daniel's body and needs. "Ghost, I can't," Daniel started. "This must cost thousands." "It's already paid for," Ghost interrupted. The Guardian Brotherhood took donations. Every brother contributed. Consider it a gift from family. Daniel transferred to the new chair. It fit perfectly, moved smoothly, had proper support. For the first time in 3 years, he had equipment that actually worked for his body. He cried. Rebecca cried. Ghost tried not to cry but failed. "You saved my life," Ghost said quietly. "I was done, ready to give up, and you shared your sandwich. The least I can do is make sure you've got the right wheels." But Ghost had one more surprise. "Also," he said, pulling out an envelope, "the Guardian Brotherhood has established a scholarship fund for kids who show exceptional character despite facing adversity. You're the first recipient." Inside was a check for $10,000, earmarked for Daniel's future education. "This is for college," Ghost said, "or NASA training, or whatever dream you're chasing. Because the world needs people like you, Daniel. People who see others when everyone else looks away." 6 months later, late April, Daniel was sitting in the same park where he'd first met Ghost, wearing his protected by Brotherhood vest over a t-shirt. His new wheelchair gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Beside him, Ghost sat on the same bench, where he'd once sat broken and hopeless. "You know what's weird?" Daniel said. "I used to wish I wasn't disabled. Used to think if I could just walk normally, my life would be better. And now," Ghost asked, "now I think maybe things happen the way they were supposed to. I mean, I still wish I didn't have cerebral palsy. I'm not going to pretend it's great. But if I wasn't in this wheelchair, I probably wouldn't have noticed you that day. I would have been like everyone else who walked past." Ghost nodded. Suffering gives you perspective. Not that you deserve to suffer, you didn't, but it made you who you are. Made you someone who sees invisible people. Like you, Daniel said. Like me, Ghost agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching kids play basketball on the nearby courts. One of those kids, a seventh grader named Marcus, who'd been bullied until the Guardian Brotherhood stepped and waved at Daniel. Daniel waved back. Ghost? Daniel said. Yeah, buddy. Thank you. For everything. For the wheelchair, the scholarship, the visits, all of it. But mostly just, thanks for caring, for making me feel like I matter. Ghost's throat tightened. Daniel, you changed my life. I was at the end, had nothing left, and you gave me purpose again. Reminded me what the code was really about. You didn't just share a sandwich, you shared hope, so thank you. We saved each other, Daniel said with wisdom beyond his 12 years. Yeah, Ghost said, smiling. We did. A motorcycle rolled into the park. Smokey, pulling up next to where Ghost had parked his bike. Ready? Smokey called. Got another escort in Bend at 4. Ghost stood. Duty calls? Daniel grinned. Go save the world, Ghost. One kid at a time, Ghost replied. He clasped Daniel's shoulder, a gesture of affection and respect between brothers. Then he walked to his motorcycle, pulled on his helmet, and fired up the engine. As Ghost rode away, Daniel pulled out his phone and texted his mom, home in 20. Love you. Rebecca responded immediately. Love you too, sweetheart. Dinner's almost ready. Ghost coming? Not tonight. He's got work. Daniel typed back, smiling at how work meant protecting another kid who needed it. Daniel started rolling home, his new wheelchair moving smoothly, his vest keeping him warm against the spring breeze. Students from school saw him and waved. Mr. Patel from the convenience store called out a greeting. Daniel Cooper was no longer invisible. But more importantly, he'd learned the most crucial lesson of his young life, that one act of kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples that spread farther than you can imagine. That compassion is never wasted. That sometimes the people who look the scariest are the ones with the biggest hearts. And that brotherhood isn't about blood or biology. It's about showing up for each other when it matters most. If Daniel's story moved you, I need you to do something right now. First, hit that subscribe button. Be part of a community that celebrates kindness, that stands with underdogs, that refuses to look away when someone needs help. Second, comment, I stand with Daniel. If you believe that one small act of kindness can change the world, let's flood this comment section with solidarity. Show the algorithm that these stories matter, that compassion deserves visibility. Third, and this is crucial, share this video. Share it with someone who's struggling. Share it with someone who feels invisible. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that good people still exist, that communities still protect their vulnerable, that one sandwich shared in a moment of generosity can trigger a movement. Because somewhere right now, there's another Daniel, another kid being overlooked, bullied, dismissed, another person at rock bottom who needs someone to see them. Your share might reach them. Your engagement might give them hope. The Guardian Brotherhood is real. They're operating in 14 states now, protecting kids, escorting students, showing up when systems fail. If you want to support their work, links are in the description. Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's sharing your lunch when you're hungry too. It's stopping when everyone else walks past. It's choosing kindness when the world makes it hard. Daniel chose kindness. Ghost repaid it with brotherhood. And together they prove that the smallest acts create the biggest ripples. Thanks for watching. Thanks for caring. And remember, you never know when sharing your sandwich might save someone's life. The world needs more Daniels, more Ghosts, more people who simply show up. Be that person. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.